Good to be with you again. I hope you don't mind if I share a lot of memories with you today about my youth, where I came from. We celebrated on August 1 the feast of St. Alphonsus Liguori, who died in 1787, who founded the Redemptorist Order. And when I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, it was in the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. The popes years ago had given to the Redemptorists the task of promoting devotion to Our Lady under the title of Perpetual Help. And my grandmother owned a home, 3-story brownstone, across the street from the great Basilica of St. Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And so it was there that I was baptized, March 15th. And I guess in those days there were probably 15, 20, 30 children being baptized, but it so happened the priest assigned to do baptism that day was a Stanley Lewandowski. And he said that I was the first baby he baptized with his own name. Some years later, after my ordination, Mom found out where he was, and we went over to the Jersey Shore to see him. He was retired then and in his last days, so he could see that a baby he baptized eventually became a priest. And of course, I can always remember going to the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Help across the street and seeing the image of St. Alphonsus, the statue showing a very aged, bearded old bishop bent over. He was the founder of the Redemptorist Order that, of course, had the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. They must have had 20 or 30 priests assigned there, and they would go out to give missions in various parishes and give retreats and such. So it was a large church. In fact, the Diocese of Brooklyn very often used it for the installation of new bishops and ordination and such. I always remember my very first memory, and I don't know how often people can remember back to their earliest years, but I remember very distinctly before I was 2 years old, sitting in my grandmother's lap. She was in her rocking chair on the second floor of the brownstone, looking out the bay window over toward the church and watching this procession of men in black and white making their way up to Fifth Avenue so they could go up the high steps to the upper church. And at the end of the procession, some men came dressed in gold. I realized later it was a first Mass. They had so many vocations from that parish that every June for 2 or 3 weeks they would have 2 or 3 first Masses every Sunday. So I guess my grandmother was planting the first seed of a priestly vocation. I, of course, made my first confession and first communion there and entered the parochial school. I remember there had to be 95 children in our class with the Sisters of St. Joseph from Brentwood on Long Island. I often thought if I had remained there in Brooklyn, I probably would have ended up as a Redemptorist priest. I remember growing up there, and of course it was the days of the Second World War. I remember December 7th going with Mom to a delicatessen, which I guess opened for a few hours so people could get fresh cold cuts. And some lady said to a neighbor, "Did you hear what happened today? The Japanese bombed our naval base at Pearl Harbor." And the other lady said, "Well, where's Pearl Harbor?" And she said, it's in Hawaii. Well, where's Hawaii? Yeah, Americans were being shocked into the realization of a world war. And I remember those days as dark days. I guess especially because they knew there were enemy submarines off the coast looking to identify New York Harbor. And so all the people were required to have special shades so that no light would shine outside the home. It made everything very, very dark. And every street would have its block captain who would make sure everyone complied with the regulations. And I remember Mom sending me to the store for a pound of flour or sugar, whatever, and not only having some money, but the all-important rationing stamp. Without that stamp, you couldn't get so many items. My special job was every week when we would get a plastic container of lard, and there was a little button on it with some coloring, and it was my job to always work that coloring all through the white lard to make it look like butter. It happened that our family had to move from Brooklyn. At the time, Mom was not at all happy, but she came to realize as the years went on, what a blessing that was. She often said, we would never have been able to buy the home they bought in Flushing, New York, in Queens County. I think it was like $7,500. And of course, after the war, home prices jumped through the ceilings. So we were in a home 1 block away from St. Kevin's Church and school. And I know when Mom took me there, and it was October, the children were getting ready for Halloween. And the first reaction of the sister principal was, no, we're too full. But I had very good grades from Lady Perpetual Help School, so she took me in. I was in a class of 32 who would be graduating each year in February, and we would be put in with a class graduating in June of 58. So there were some 90 children in every class. And when I think of it now, the sister had to teach one class while the other group did a written assignment, then she would switch. I don't know how those sisters did it, and how somehow we learned. I remember having usually a seat in the aisle near the side blackboard, and if I had to get up, then the boy next to me had to get out of his seat so I could get through his seat. And there were so many seats in the front and the back of the classroom, extra seats, that when the sister came from the mother house in Dallas, Pennsylvania, the one who was in charge of music, all she could do was get into the door of the room. She couldn't move even across the front or the sides because of all the desks. But somehow we learned. And in the 7th grade, I became one of the altar servers. One of the nuns taught us the Latin to respond to the priest. That was an interesting insight into the Catholic priesthood. There were 4 priests in our parish. The elderly pastor who had come from Ireland and suffering from arthritis, Monsignor DeLay. And there was a younger priest, Father Rudden, who took care of the altar service. And the next assistant, Father Joe Keys, was sort of my favorite, my model. He just radiated such happiness in the Catholic priesthood. The senior assistant was the exact opposite. He always seemed angry and upset about something, and in a way he became the model for me of what I would not want to be as a priest. So I guess I had a lot of mixed feelings about priesthood. As I went on to high school, one of the two from that parish to be sent to the diocesan high school in Brooklyn, Bishop Lachlan Memorial High School. It was conducted by the Christian Brothers, and it had been built on the site of what was supposed to be the Cathedral of the Diocese of Brooklyn. Again, the Christian Brothers were tough. They were very demanding, and so were the lay teachers. I became involved with the library of the school. There was an extracurricular activity, and so Brother Claudius William, who was the librarian, spent a good time with me at times talking about priesthood, vocation, and urging me not to give up on the thought of diocesan priesthood. When I graduated from Bishop Lachlan High School, I got a scholarship to the St. John's College, which was then located in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn. So both to go to high school and to college, those 6 years, involved a 15-minute bus trip into Flushing, then an elevated train to Jackson Heights, where I would go down 99 steps into the subway, the Independent Line as it was called, to go to my high school and then later to college. I would get off for college 2 stops earlier, but then have to walk 4 blocks. And on each of the blocks, there was a Jewish synagogue or training school for rabbis. At St. John's, of course, when I said I was interested in pre-seminary course, then I was sent to the Chancery of Brooklyn to register and or to qualify for the exemption on the draft. And the secretary gave me an application for the seminary of the Diocese of Brooklyn. And I said, oh no, I didn't want that. I wanted to go to another diocese somewhere in the US that would need priests. And she said, no, that's the application you need. I thought, well, Mom and Dad are going to be surprised tonight when I tell them I just filled out the application for the seminary. And the Monsignor met with me and allowed me to stay at St. John's because I had the scholarship. But I was thinking, and Mom used to get the Extension magazine, which had a lot of stories about the Catholic Church in parts of our country that are not very Catholic. And at times on vacation in the South or going to the West, in Wyoming, we could see the missionary Catholic Church. And I thought, yeah, that's what I think I should do. I think that's what the Lord is calling me to. And at St. John's, those 2 years in the beginning, we had that kind of odd schedule. The second year, I would have to go through the summer so that we would no longer be graduating in February, but again, with everybody else in June. So I had a lot of opportunity to read in the library of the college. And I began to read periodicals and things I was amazed because I was learning that the Pope since the 1900s, St. Pius X, had been calling for this renewal of Catholic liturgy, that Catholics were being encouraged to participate actively, to speak at Mass. And I thought, well, that's certainly not happening in my parish, or any that I can see anywhere in this area. I could read a lot about what was happening in some places in the Midwest. So I thought, that's what I'll do. I'll offer myself to some diocese that needs priests and would probably use my services in a way to foster that liturgical revival. obviously, I didn't know that God one day would give us a Pope John the 23rd and a Second Vatican Council. So it was that I simply wrote to Father Godfrey Diekman, the editor of Worship Magazine out in Minnesota, and that was the center of the liturgical revival in the U.S. And he suggested maybe Superior, Wisconsin Diocese. So I wrote there, and I was accepted as a seminarian for that missionary diocese in the north of Wisconsin, and sent to the St. John's Seminary in Collegeville, Minnesota for my first year of theology. And I loved it. I was one of 10 out of the 100 seminarians who were from the East. And of course the Midwesterners said, oh, you Easterners don't know what winter is like until you've lived in Minnesota. But actually we found they were putting on heavier clothing than we sooner, because we were used to this cold, biting winter weather. It seemed in the Midwest, if you stood behind a building or tree, it usually was a pretty dry cold. I loved it there. I think I had a couple of the very best teachers I've ever had. Father Achilles Horvath was a Benedictine from Hungary. And the previous year, the Hungarian people had revolted against the communist regime, and so he was able to get out in that week of freedom, and he was just the greatest teacher. Man, he gave us a beautiful introduction to the doctrine of the Catholic Church all through the centuries. Also, Father Godfrey Diekman gave us a beautiful course in patristics. But at Christmas time, when I returned to Mom and Dad for a couple of weeks vacation, I realized they were thinking about moving to the Midwest, and I never intended that. I'm an only child. Yeah, I should have thought of that. So when I went back, I began to think that maybe this is not God's will for me. That was the year the great flu epidemic hit. January, February, March. At one point, 1/3 of the 100 seminarians were sick in bed. I was one of the last ones to go down, and at that point, so many people were sick of sickness that they would forget to bring my food tray up at lunch. But I had a lot of time sitting, laying there, praying, thinking, yeah, I think God wants me to go another direction. And in college, I had two close friends I worked with in various extracurricular activities. One was a Phil Seary, who was related in some way to a Father Bill Cooming in the Diocese of Wilmington. And so he had become accepted as a seminarian for Wilmington. And his friend, our friend John O'Brien, who was a year after me in college, he also was connected with Wilmington. So I thought, well, Wilmington is close enough to New York so my folks could stay there, but not too close. I guess I sense I will need some space if I'm to enter into the ministry. And so it was that I was released by Superior, Wisconsin. I never had to preach to all the wolves and the bears of the Northwoods, and instead was sent by the Diocese of Wilmington to Theological College at the Catholic University of America for my last 3 years of theology. It was a very good assignment. It meant attending classes at the Catholic University. And actually, at times, I felt the professors I had in Minnesota had been greater teachers. But it's all God's plan for us. It worked out well. I was there for the dedication of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, November 21 of 1960. And so in February of 61, I was ordained, 60, I was ordained to the minor orders of the church, and then the following year to the diaconate and subdiaconate and the National Shrine. And of course, then in May of 61, I was ordained a priest here in Wilmington. So that's the story of my early life. As I said, sometimes I remember saying that God writes straight with crooked lines. So I guess he did his will and got me where I am today. Thank you for reflecting with me on this life.